Hey there. In this video, I'm going to talk about sections 3 and 4 of the training projects. Section 3 starts with descriptions of the interventions. So you have 2 function-based interventions that you're going to be reviewing. You already know that you have a specific function and that you have 2 interventions that you'll be connecting to that function for your training materials and for your training manual. In this section is where you give a brief overview of the literature for the trainer. And so you're going to want to go through each of those function-based interventions. I'm going to use non-contingent reinforcement and differential reinforcement as examples. This semester you take this, we might have other interventions in there. Okay, so what should you include in a brief overview? First of all, this is for a qualified professional to be serving as the trainer. And so you're going to want to explain the behavioral principles, explaining the effectiveness of your function-based differential reinforcement procedure. You do not focus on other functions, just for the function that you've been identified. If you decide to include another function in there as a non-example, that's perfectly fine, but you're not expected to do that. You should discuss for differential reinforcement the role of extinction, and you should describe the literature on thinning schedules of reinforcement and how to connect them to your form of differential reinforcement. All too often, we put interventions in place without a plan to thin the schedule of reinforcement or to eventually fade the intervention altogether. And so you want to be able to thin the schedule of reinforcement so that it still maintains the behavior and reduces the demand on the environment, but still maintains appropriate behavior. You want to be able to talk about the limitations of differential reinforcement as a function-based intervention in the literature. And you want to talk about the limitations of how well the research reflects direct care staff population. Another limitation is how well does the research reflect the clients that you're serving? What are the practical applications of your function-based DR? For example, is it easy to implement? Can it be used with more than one client simultaneously? Is it inexpensive? Can families easily be taught to use it at home? And so on and so forth. What are the practical applications? What's the benefits? Now, you want to make sure you include at least 3 empirical articles that are not included in the required readings for this course. But I'll say this. Your goal is to ideally include as many references as you need, not to plagiarize. And so there's going to be information that you put in there that 3 might not be enough. If you get the right 3, it might be enough, but you might need to go more than 3. Okay. Then you're also going to do the same thing with an overview of non-contingent reinforcement. You're going to go through the behavioral principles and the literature on thinning schedules of reinforcement, or non-contingent reinforcement, the limitations of non-contingent reinforcement, the benefits and practical applications, and of course, everything should be appropriately referenced. And the last thing in section 3 is choosing between your 2 different function-based interventions. So in this case, differential reinforcement and non-contingent reinforcement. How will you know whether DR or NCR is a more appropriate intervention for a given client? You can, of course, reference what you've already written in the benefits and practical application sections. And so you can just refer back to that. But you should also be incorporating other information you know about selecting treatments appropriately. So for example, I know in previous coursework, you've probably read a practical guide to finding treatments that work for people with autism. This is a resource that can help you develop some explanations for this section. There are some videos about evidence-based practice, also by me, Susan Wolchinski. If you want to look those up online, I know I did one with Western Michigan. And so use those resources to help you identify what are variables I should be thinking about, what client variables, what contextual variables will help me select between one function-based intervention versus another. All right, that's section 3. In section 4, you're going to have a vocabulary list. And here, you definitely want to have a vocabulary list for your trainer using very behavioral terminology. But you can't just copy and paste. Really, there shouldn't be any quotes in anything in this manual. It should all be your words. This is an opportunity for you to practice describing every behavioral term that you use in this manual in your own words. That's going to help you master those materials. Until you can phrase something in your own words, you're still really struggling with the concept. The definitions for your vocabulary words, like I said, can be written in a very behavioral way for the trainer. You're not required to include the definitions for vocabulary words that you'll be using with the direct care staff, but know that for your training materials themselves, you're going to have to change the language so that it matches the needs of your direct care staff. And a lot of students like to put a vocabulary section in here for their direct care staff as well. I'll leave that up to you. What else are you going to need in section 4? Here's where you're going to connect client outcomes. Remember, we've talked about this before. The purpose of training is to get high fidelity. And the purpose of getting high fidelity is to be able to produce the intended outcomes for our clients. These things are directly connected. The other advantage of for client outcomes is if I picked an intervention that isn't working, if I'm not having it implemented accurately and measuring the effect on my clients, I'm not going to know whether or not the intervention is effective or not. Even if all the literature in the world says it's an effective treatment, if it's not effective with this client, I need to know that as quickly as possible so I can shift to a more appropriate intervention. So in this section, you're going to connect what you've been writing about your function-based interventions. I want you to have for both DR and for non-contingent reinforcement, a couple of examples of a target behavior, including an operational definition, the measurement system that you'd use to assess the client behavior and why this is an appropriate measurement system. Let's say you pick frequency measurement, why is that appropriate? If you do interval recording or momentary time sampling, why is that an appropriate method? Then you want to graph an example. So you'll just generate your own data here. And what you want to do is also identify what kind of single subject research design you would use to test whether or not there's a functional relationship. And so you're going to want to describe what that single subject research design is, identify what it is, briefly describe it, and then you want to clearly state that this can demonstrate a functional relationship between the intervention and the client outcomes. Okay, the last thing you're going to include in section 4 is the references. You do want to use APA style. We're on the 7th edition now, so make sure you use that. Purdue OWL has the 7th edition. They actually still have both of them up, so make sure you're in the right area if you don't have a manual. And so you're going to want to make sure you reference every bit of material in the manual in this section. So you don't want to have it in every separate section. All of it goes into one section right here in section 4. I generally recommend for this section that the whole manual should be single spaced. For this section, I recommend still single spacing, but having a double space in between each reference. It's going to make it easier to read. And really, that's it for section 4. If you've got questions, reach out to your instructor.